Well, welcome to video 17 of this series called Seriously. We're covering chapter 68 and 69 of Skye Jethani's book, What If Jesus Was Serious? And so we're kind of really close to the end here.
Yeah, we're getting right down to the last couple of verses now.
That's right. And so, here as we get to the end of this, jumping right in here, Jesus kind of ends off this talk with this parable, just a folksy tale that would illustrate a truth. And so I'm just gonna read this parable out because I think it's actually quite a well-known one.
Oh yeah, it's one of my favorites for sure. And I mean, I heard this since I was a small child. We even sang songs about it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think a lot of people also probably know who not followers of Jesus or not have any sort of Bible background, probably heard some version of this, but here it is. It starts with verse 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them in practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash.
And I think when I was a child, and I would say even into my adulthood, I always took this as a metaphor, as a difference between Christians, people who respond to Jesus' message, and sort of people who reject Jesus' message or non-Christians.
That's right.
And so the Christians were the people where they're building their house on the rock, and the people who weren't followers of Jesus were represented by the foolish man who built his house on the sand. But that's really not what Skye or Jesus was really talking about. So.
No, not at all. It's definitely a challenge to the listeners of this sermon. Because he's been talking about narrow roads. Yeah. He's talking about good fruit. Mm-hmm. And so, the one thing I've never really considered when thinking about this story is the idea that the house may not look any different. The houses may not look any different.
And that is really interesting to me, because a lot of times when I've seen it depicted as a cartoon or even as a live action, you always see sort of the guy building the one house over on the mountain or whatever, and the other guy building his on the beach. And really, according to this, they could be built side by side for all we know.
Really close together.
Close together. And so you're right. From the outside, the houses could have looked the same.
Yeah, and really, it is talking about two different kind of Christians, or directly in this case, there are two different ways to be listening.
Yeah,
both of these individuals represented would have heard the same thing. And Daniel Aiken, in his commentary, says, at first glance, there do not appear to be any differences between the two. Both builders heard Jesus. They both go ahead and build a house after having heard the sermon, built in the same general location. Both houses, at least outwardly, look similar.
So what's the difference?
Well, where John Stott, like Skye taught, we'll say this: it's the deep foundation. It's the things that are hidden from the view, not so much the things that we.
And that really ties more into what Jesus has been saying all along through this chapter.
Well, absolutely. You go back and it's just what we talked about. The verses right before we talked about in the last video. People saying, "Lord, Lord, didn't we not prophesy in your name, drive out demons in your name, perform miracles?" These very visible acts, very impressive acts, yet it's coming right down. And it's a pretty bold statement. One's wise and one's not.
Yep.
There's not really any gray area in there.
Yeah, and I think probably the word fool held a little more weight in their culture than it does in ours.
Possibly, but I think you get the point. It's just like, he's not praising what is seen. He's calling wise and what is not seen, and praising what we naturally wouldn't necessarily praise. And it really is the foundation that determines whether what is built truly endures.
Yeah, and so it's a call for not just to hear this sermon and respond to it even in a way that it might be visible, but really to live out the teachings on an ongoing basis in your day-to-day acts, live with Jesus in a relationship that impacts your life in both the small things and potentially the big things, and not just seek out the big things.
Yeah, and I think it's very similar to essentially what James would write. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in James 1, verse 23, anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away immediately and forgets what he looks like. Because that's a strong statement too. And I think anyone be hearing that would have been just like, well, that's dumb. And essentially, in a lot of ways, it's kind of what Jesus was saying. Just like, hey, we're not supposed to walk away from this and say, you know what, that was really good.
Yeah,
I'm really glad I made that trek out here to listen to Jesus talk.
Mm-hmm.
He's basically saying, hey, now that I've said this, what really matters is applying it and putting it into practice. Mm-hmm. And I think this is really a way if we're truly looking back, at the premise of this book and all that sort of stuff, to answer that question, what if Jesus was serious? Jesus kind of illustrates with this. He's pretty serious because he just says, he just called the one who obeys and does what was said is wise.
Yeah, and so that's the part I think we often overlook, is that one who hears my teachings and puts it into practice.
Yeah.
Lots of people can hear the teachings, and lots of people have said, oh, that's nice, or that's good, or I agree with that, or I think Jesus is okay, or that's good for you.
Yeah.
But they don't put it into practice in any way, shape, or form.
Well, it does go back to the trap we can find ourselves in that we can hear this really good thing and be more enamored with the knowledge of it.
Yeah.
And the ability to articulate it. But Jesus is like, that's not the point of this.
He's really calling us to make a choice.
Are you going to do it?
Are you going to follow me or not?
Yeah. And he's being pretty direct. I think, the wise man is going to weather the storm. The fool is going to succumb to the storm. The wise one is going to stand up to scrutiny, and the foolish one is going to crumble when under intensity. And so there is this challenge, really, is to follow through. And Scott McKnight actually points out in the sermon that it's actually throughout the whole the Sermon on the Mount, throughout the whole thing, Jesus does set up quite often two options. He's given two options here, but
and they're usually polar opposites.
Exactly. It's basically if you look at chapter 5, Matthew 5, 17 to 20, it's Pharisees versus the followers of Jesus. Mm-hmm. You go to chapter 6, 1 to 18, it's hypocrites versus the followers of Jesus.
Yep.
There's good treasure versus bad treasures. There's good eyes versus bad eyes. There's God versus money. There is anxiety versus seeking God's kingdom. Then you get to chapter 7, there's wide path versus narrow path, good tree versus bad tree, doing versus not doing.
So that's brings us to kind of where we are today. We're faced with a choice. We're looking, or we have been studying Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and we've determined that he is being serious.
Yep.
And so it comes down to what is the foundation we want to build on. Is it a life lived with God, a life of prayer and confession and discipline, and including Jesus in the moments of our day?
Yep.
Or going our own way and not surrendering?
Sure. And to go further, it's also, are we going to found our life on what Scott McKnight calls the Jesus Creed, the love God and love others?
Yep.
In the idea of, or being show that love lived out by following that golden rules to friends, to strangers, to those we find difficult, and those we might see as enemies.
As enemies, yeah. That's all that, again, they found the teaching hard then. I still find it hard.
Absolutely.
And I know it came up in something I was talking to my wife about at breakfast when we were talking about something similar in a book we've been reading. Mm-hmm. And the author talked about something called the platinum rule as opposed to the golden rule.
Right.
And I think we touched on this actually in one of our videos we talked about too, whereas it's not doing just something for somebody else that you would like to see done for you. Sometimes we need to get to know that person and know what their needs and wants are and do that for them, which is going one step beyond just what you would have do.
Exactly. It is getting to know that person and I think it's even realizing that, oh yeah, I would like it if people did something like that to me, because it's time to get to know me, to understand, well, I'm passionate about what I like. Well, then should I not return that?
Yeah. And that's the difference, I think, between being kind to others or taking care of others and actually loving others.
That's absolutely true. And so it really leads us to this whole thing. The idea is what is unseen, this foundation, is really what's most important. So the other day I was listening to a podcast of Wayne Gretzky.
Who?
Wayne Gretzky.
Wayne Gretzky.
Don't you know that? He's like 61 years old.
Yeah. I'm 61 years old.
I know. I'm sorry. And that's where we're ending the podcast. Anyway, it's
Wayne Gretzky.
Wayne Gretzky. Let's go back. And so the hosts were just basically kind of talking about his love of golf and would he kind of like, hey, when you do golf much like you did hockey, could you do that too? Just you love golf this much? And his answer was no, because he did not want to put in all of the work needed to really be able to play and be competitive at that level. And, and he talked about the time, what time he put into hockey, when we see the games, we see it televised, we look at the documentaries, all that sort of stuff. But there's just the years and years and hours of practice. The years before he ever, put on an Edmonton Oiler jersey and we got to know this phenomenal player, no one knew who he was, and just the childhood, the hours spent that, I think sometimes we say, I wish we could be, whatever that is, like that, just be amazing. Like musicians are like this too. Like they see the big concert, but we're not seeing the hours and hours of mastering their instrument.
Yeah. And I think that reminds me of a book by Malcolm Gladwell where he talks about the 10,000 hour rule, where you have to put in the practice, you have to put in the time, you have to put in the hard work that usually nobody sees. They talk about bands playing in places where they're
the Beatles in that book.
They're playing to audiences of a few people, and they're put on after the band that's after the main band kind of thing. And you got to put in the time to work through all that before you get to the point where you've actually mastered something to be able to play at that level.
That's right. And so everyone sees this like, wow, they're really good, they're really formed. But it's all of the unseen things that establish their ability. And that's really what Jesus is really talking about. All this unseen things that really establishes everything.
And the perseverance and necessary to kind of stick with it and keep going.
I think it's when the idea of coming to following Jesus and becoming a citizen in God's kingdom, like the Sermon on the Mount is really about seeing life from God's point of view, how he sees people. And then when it becomes our foundation, how he sees others is how we start to see others.
Right.
And God's worldview becomes our worldview. And I love what Norman Geisler writes about this. He says, the truth is that a worldview is like colored glasses. It colors everything at which we look. It is the grid through which one views all of life. As such, it helps form our thoughts, values, and decisions.
I like that. And that we really need to have God's view of ourselves, because I think we quite often get the wrong idea of what God thinks of us. We think God doesn't like us, or God won't forgive us, or we have all those things, when really he just loves us so much that he wants us to have a restored relationship with him, and to be able to live a full life the way he intended it.
Yeah, and I think you see some of that, because Jesus will teach the Our Father, which definitely sees, like this relational side of this connection that he wants to make with us. It's not this, all the rituals or whatever that he's basically going to say, religious leaders, you're saying that. No, just Our Father who art in heaven, holy is your name. Just like that's really, hey, this is how God wants to interact with you.
Wants to interact on a personal and intimate level. Yeah.
And so, and it just a little bit remind me of just, what we talked about a couple of videos ago with the idea of looking at leaders. We want to see that the fruit in their lives, not just these impressive successes, and that's the foundation that everything is built on, like generosity and patience and love and kindness and
that it takes time and proximity to really see and understand those things.
Yeah, and just like any kind of foundation, you're not going to walk up to the building and be like aware of all the foundations. You really have to.
Well, when you think about when a foundation's being built, it takes months.
Yeah.
And it looks like nothing is happening. You drive by, and that it's just a hole in the ground, and you see guys working down there, but you don't really see what they're doing or what's happening. And then it seems like you drive by a week later, and the walls are up and the frame is up, and it's like, wow, that thing's really going up fast now. And really, a lot of the hard work has already been done in laying the foundation and putting in all the infrastructure for the building before the part that can be seen goes up.
That's right. Yeah, and so it's kind of the idea of like almost like whatever is being built, big or small, elaborate or simple, that's really not what the important part is.
Mm-hmm.
It's making sure that it's loving God and loving others is whatever is being built, that is the foundation, the things that we see in through the Sermon on the Mount. And again, it's just, as we mentioned last video, it's Skye's warning, which is entirely possible to spend one's life devoted to God's mission as a substitute of being devoted to God himself. So it's very easy to build up a beautiful building, metaphorical. In this case, a beautiful building in it really
beautiful podcast.
Yeah. In it really being on a faulty foundation.
On a faulty foundation, yeah. So, that's it. Sort of summarizes all the videos, and I like how we kind of brought this to a close here. And we've I just got one or two more videos to go. Right. I'm excited for those. So, thank you for joining us today as we've talked through the last little bit of Matthew chapter 7 on the Sermon on the Mount. And again, hopefully it leaves you with some questions, as well as maybe helped you think through some things and get some answers too. And we'd love to hear from you. If you want to leave a comment in the comment section, we've put some notes in the show notes for you to click on there. And there's some questions for reflection that you can just use yourself to think through some things, or always helpful if you talk them through with a friend, or if you're part of our church community with your missional community. And that way we can continue to work on these things, because it doesn't just happen all at once. And I like how Jesus uses a lot of farming metaphors in a lot of his parables, including the Sermon on the Mount, where these things do take time. It isn't something that just happens overnight, and transformation is a long process, and we're all still working through it. And I'm glad that you could be part of this with us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. And please, if you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe.